From the early attempts offering nothing more than purely going up against the clock, the arcade racer truly evolved to offering so much more of a challenge. Whilst many arcade versions would make the jump to home systems, there were those which would offer more than just chasing checkpoints. And one of those which truly showed how 16-bit machines could tackle this was Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge. This is Beyond The Scanlines, a series focusing on interesting games on classic computing and gaming platforms. Originally released for the Amiga with an Atari ST conversion in 1990, Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge comes to us from the crew over at Magnetic Fields, who by this point were known for supercars and less for their previous incarnation as Mr. Chip Software, with the publishing duties handled by Gremlin. The goal is straightforward: race across the 3 championships over a total of 32 courses and aim to get to the end, get the most points and earn your Lotus license. Opening up, you've got this great intro sequence which shows off the actual car with plenty of stats and fancy shots, plus that killer opening track. It's some luscious presentation here and certainly mood setting, and not just because it shows off that 16-bit power in action. The main options available are for 1 or 2 players, which championship you wish to tackle, and various control options. Compared to many of its peers, the number of courses on offer is astounding, with a total of 32 split between the easy, medium, and hard championships. On the controls front, support for both automatic and manual gears is especially appreciated, alongside the alternate input mode, which allows you to hold the fire button to accelerate over moving the joystick up. As noted in the manual, this is the recommended control setup, and it's certainly the one I feel works better, especially as you start playing the longer races. Over in the land of the 8-bits, where Gremlin also commissioned conversions to the usual suspects, and switching over to the Commodore 64 version, can see that the intro is brought over mostly intact. It even is loaded prior to the main game, at least when you're playing the disc version, though for tape owners, it's squirreled away after the main game has loaded. As for the options screen, the C64 happens to pretty much mirror what is offered on the Amiga version, a choice of 1 or 2 players, the easy, medium and hard championships alongside the same control options. This doesn't quite apply with the ZX Spectrum conversion, though most of the things are still here. Unsurprisingly, the intro is heavily cut down, which shouldn't really surprise you as this game needs to work on both the 48 and 128K spectrums. Playing on the latter is seriously recommended, as despite the long load, it does mean all, and I mean all, the courses will be loaded into memory up front. This makes for a big advantage over its 8-bit peer. The menus here have been simplified somewhat, with the control options tweaked as well, replacing the fire to accelerate option with automatic acceleration instead. Now, this is a change which is quite beneficial for those who are lumped to playing this with the Spectrum's keyboard. Now, once you've configured everything to your desire, it's time to hit the track. Before that, there's one last choice: your desired in-game music. The Amiga version presents this choice as if you're changing tracks on your car's CD player, in a way making for a modern riff on the radio selection screen from Outrun. On the flip side, the Commodore 64 version presents this choice in a way similar to that shown in the main menu. On the Spectrum, it's a similar scenario, though this time the choice is part of the main menu instead of being separated on a new screen. Before starting each race, you'll be given a brief overview of the course, with the conditions and pointers as to what to expect, alongside details on any obstacles you'll encounter. Then you hit fire, and you'll be taken to the road. Moving on to the next course requires you to place inside the top 10. At least that's how it plays on the Amiga and C64 versions. Spectrum-wise, the field is reduced to 16 cars, at least in the single-player mode. When moving to 2-player mode, this is reduced even further, down to 10. So that means you need to get into the top 8 in single player and the top 5 in 2-player. Regardless of the version you're playing, when in 2-player mode, only a single player must qualify to move on to the next course. When it comes to the racing mechanics, they're quite common to those you'll find in other races. Complete a given number of laps, whilst overtaking rival cars and avoiding the obstacles along the way. The earlier courses, which you'll find in the easy and medium championships, tend to be pretty chilled on that front. Though, once you get to those hard courses, things will get seriously challenging. One of the things I really love about the Amiga version is just how open the courses are. Compared to many other races, you've got a lot of room to move about on the course. Quite a blessing in disguise, and one you're going to be thankful for as you keep racing on. It's a shame that neither the C64 or Spectrum version is able to have such wide roads, but again, being 8-bit machines, the hardware is always going to be the limit on that front. The obstacles come in both surface hazards like patches of water or oil, and they'll throw you off course, meaning you have to struggle to regain control, but there's also bigger objects like barriers and rocks. These will slow you down if you happen to crash into them. And it's kind of where things vary a lot between the machines. On the Amiga, they'll impact you modestly. You'll be slowed down a bit, but that one won't knock you back to a snail's pace. Subsequent ones will though, which is similar to what happens with the C64 version. Hitting an obstacle here will seriously put a dent in your speed. It's probably the biggest frustration I have, because even a glancing hit will do this to you, and it can become quite frustrating on some of the harder courses. Spectrum owners though, they get a bit of a reprieve here, because there are no obstacles on the course. This is really another conceit made to get the gameplay speed up, and it means a lot of the challenge is lost here. Enough so that whilst I failed early on with the hardest championships on both the C64 and Amiga versions, I was able to actually complete the hardest one on the Spectrum, even coming first in the process. Now, another mechanic which is a little different from other arcade races, and that's your gear shifting. Going as far back as classics like pole position, arcade races typically offered you a low and a high gear, and that more or less worked pretty well. In a nod towards realism though, the 5-speed gearbox of the real-life Lotus is emulated here, and this can be quite a pain when recovering from a collision with another vehicle or an obstacle. Especially with the C64 version, where you get slowed down quite a lot as a result. I found having to rapidly downshift after these incidents was quite fiddly, and personally I found myself enjoying the game more when I flipped to the computerized gear options. It removed the need for me to worry about gear shifting, instead letting me focus on the racing experience. This is also complicated somewhat by how your rivals move about the course. In most races, the AI is split between sticking to a single lane or changing lanes as you close in. That isn't the case here. Instead, whilst some drivers will stick to a single lane, others will ping pong constantly from side to side of the road, which means getting ahead of them really needs some precise execution and timing in order to cut through them on the inside. Now, of course, it's no surprise to say that this usually bites you when trying to corner, as you'll be working to maintain your racing line for optimum speed, and suddenly find yourself needing to brake, or almost veer into the side scenery in order to avoid an imminent collision from a rival. It's probably the one thing that really bothers me with the racing mechanics. Especially on the Spectrum, as I found sometimes the controls would lock up when you hit another car. It would send you into the side of the road and to a standstill, which greatly impacts how you're going in the race. The biggest support element to gameplay is of course your in-game HUD, and what it offers here is plenty of useful stats. You've got the common set, your speed, current gear, RPM gauge, and current race position. With the role fuel plays in races, a fuel gauge is also presented on screen. Then to round it off, you have a neat bar which shows the number of laps in the race and how far along the current lap you are. With the Amiga version, the bulk of this is displayed as an overlay to the side of each player's race view. In doing this, it allows for a much larger gameplay area, which is a big benefit to the racing experience. Of course, being 8-bit computers, neither the Commodore 64 or ZX Spectrum are able to pull this off, and so you get these stats positioned below each player's view. It's not really a problem on the C64, it's compact enough to not rob that much space, and everything is clear and readable, with all the elements brought over from the Amiga. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Spectrum version, because the status bar is reformatted to take up more space. You also lose the lap progress gauge, leaving you with only a counter indicating which lap you're on. The greater impact is to each player's game view, reduced in size in order to accommodate the extra details. It's reduced enough so that when you're driving over hills, the view will shift. And when this occurs, it's quite possible for your car to be partially scrolled off the screen. This doesn't really help with learning the tracks, or even being ready for upcoming corners, simply because you just cannot see the road up ahead. But back to the fuel gauge. Unsurprisingly, it means you carry a limited amount within each race. This isn't a concern for many of the easier ones. They're short enough to make your initial fuel load more than enough. For races situated on longer courses or running for more than a few laps, it's where refueling comes into play. Thankfully, doing so is easy. Enter the pits, they're usually located just after the start of a lap, slow to a halt, and now you just have to sit back and wait for enough fuel to be pumped into your fuel tank. Then hit the accelerator to get back on the road. It's an addition which I find greatly shakes up a race, especially in the 2-player mode, because if you forget to top up, it's going to cost you, because you'll run out in mid-race, which puts yourself out of contention, at least in the single-player mode. And if you're playing multiplayer, you better hope your friend places high enough to qualify for the next race. Talking about visuals, the Amiga original looks very outstanding. There's smooth animation of the road, with plenty of colour for it, the trackside obstacles, as well as the horizon. Thanks to each player's stats being overlaid on screen, it also means these views are large, filling up a good portion of the screen, for both. This is even applicable in single player, where player 2's view instead shows the pit screen rather than giving you a full screen. Unsurprisingly, it also means the pace of the experience is quite fast, boosted by the numbers of trackside and on-track obstacles you'll encounter, making for quite a hectic race as you dodge your way through them at speed. Onto the 8-bitters, and whilst the Commodore 64 offers some limitations to its visuals, I feel they're not enough to break it here. Certainly the need to have the status information below each player's view does mean a smaller game window, but it also keeps the area clear. The speed of the racing is still kept up, and that's something I feel is quite an important feeling for sure. Now the visuals aren't as colourful as, say, Pit Stop 2, but what you do get here is far more complex tracks, and they still move at quite a quick pace. Truly though, I don't really think it's something you'll notice between dodging your rivals and avoiding all those obstacles with the core mechanics. With the Spectrum though, things do look nice. There's minimal colour clash except for around the horizon, and plenty of details. But it's sluggish. Quite sluggish. Even having fewer numbers of cars on the road, the feeling of the driving and the controls is far less responsive, I found, than on the other platforms. This also isn't helped by the issues with the controls locking up. It's playable enough, but even in single player, compared to the likes of some of the other more fondly regarded Spectrum racing games, it can be a bit of a less than engaging experience. On an audio front, the Amiga version uses the hardware quite well. The soundtrack contains pieces which are certainly rocking, and thanks to the available sound channels of the Paula chip, you typically won't hear channels cut out if you've chosen music while racing. This works nicely, as whilst you'll still get critical effects played, those from collisions or the low fuel warning, you won't be subjected to the engine sounds. Now, even though the samples sound great, they can still be something which gets repetitive over time. Jumping over to the C64, and I don't think things fare as well here. Again, like the visuals, there's a slightly dated feeling to the compositions here, and the split between music and sound effects is very distinct. You can either play the music or have all the sound effects. Whilst personally I'd have preferred the mix as per the Amiga version, I think you could get away with either choice. Whilst there's the potential for the engine to kind of feel droning, I don't really think it's that bad here. And honestly, it could certainly be tolerated for sure. All in all, it does do the job well. It's just not quite as thrilling as some of its rival games of the time. Things take a bit of a downturn on the Spectrum. While the 128K versions do include music, it only gets played on the intro sequence, the main menu, and the between race screens. Once you get to the track, you are locked into sound effects exclusively, which might not sound that bad. But then you hear the engine noise. This is quite the drowning experience, and I found when doing longer races, especially with those ones in the harder championships, it can be enough to introduce drowsiness. The way it just goes on and on and on. I don't mind the musical compositions here. Sure, they're not up to the originals, but for the AY sound hardware, I think they do a decent job. I just wished I could have had them in-game. Combined with the beeper of the 48K models, it would have been a nice way to approximate what you got on the Amiga version. As a kid, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to enjoy both the C64 port of Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge at home, but also to play the Amiga version on relatives' machines. Coming back to both now, the Amiga version is still a great play, offering crisp visuals, great music and audio, plus challenging and engaging racing action. Whilst the C64 unsurprisingly suffers a bit in the audio and visual departments, and alongside the overtly punishing crash handling, I would say it's still one of the better two-player racing games on the machine. Especially if you've had your fill of Pit Stop 2 or Scale X tricks, it's certainly worth giving it a shot. As for the ZX Spectrum version, I'm going to admit that I don't think it holds up that well. Whilst it's convenient that the 128K machines can load all the tracks in at once, this isn't enough to save it from some of the odd mechanics gameplay-wise. Elements like those responses to a crash forcing you off the road entirely, or the fact that it was all but impossible to win a race without a 100% perfect drive. Let alone the engine sound. Oh, the engine sound. One which I swear is enough to put you to sleep if you're not careful. It certainly feels a lesser driving game for sure. Unless you truly crave that two-player experience, there are far nicer races available on the Spectrum, which I feel you should check out instead. And so we've come to the end of yet another Beyond the Scanlines. If you appreciated this look back at an interesting classic, consider leaving a thumbs up on the video. Had some thoughts about any of the versions featured? Drop me a comment and let's chat. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. And yes, ringing the bell so you can be notified the moment new videos are uploaded. Finally, and probably most importantly, thank you all so very much for taking the time out to enjoy this video. Oh gosh, that C64 collision response was something I had genuinely forgotten about after all these years. It's a surprise just how a mechanic not done quite right can impact one's enjoyment of a game indeed, even if it's one you still mostly enjoy.